The bolt shell that killed me took my legs first, then my left arm, then most of my chest, and I remember thinking as the shrapnel tore through my power armor that this was a good death, a proper death, the kind of death that a brother of the Crimson Templars deserved after 200 years of faithful service to the Emperor and the chapter. Not some lingering disease or gradual decline, but a warrior's end in the heat of battle, surrounded by enemies and brothers alike. The pain was beyond anything I had experienced in 2 centuries of combat. Not the clean pain of a bolt wound or the burning pain of a last strike, but something fundamental, something that told me at a cellular level that my body was no longer a coherent whole, but a collection of parts rapidly becoming separate from each other, held together only by the enhanced biology that made me Astartes and the ceramite shell of my armor that was cracked but not yet completely broken. I could see my legs, or what remained of them, scattered across the rubble about 3 meters from where I lay, the powered servos still twitching as they received confused signals from nerves that no longer connected to anything, and my left arm was gone entirely, just gone. Vaporized or torn away, I could not tell, and when I tried to look down at my chest, I saw daylight through holes that should have been filled with organs and bone and the various biological redundancies that kept us alive when normal humans would have died. The heretics were still firing. I could hear the distinctive crack of their autogun rounds and the deeper boom of heavy bolters, but my brothers had moved in to cover my position, their red armor bright even through the haze of pain and shock that was rapidly consuming my awareness. And I remember Brother Calix, one of the younger battle brothers, who had always looked up to me with a kind of respect that made me uncomfortable because I never felt I deserved it, kneeling beside me and saying something I could not hear over the roar of blood in my ears and the hiss of escaping gases from my ruptured armor seals. "Let me die," I tried to say. "Let me die here with my brothers around me and my bolters still warm from use and my gene seed intact for the next generation." But my mouth would not form the words, my tongue thick and useless, my jaw hanging at an angle that suggested it was broken in multiple places, and the darkness was coming, the blessed darkness that would end the pain and deliver me to the Emperor's side, where I could stand beside the brothers who had fallen before me and watch over the chapter from whatever afterlife awaited the faithful. I had served for 200 years, 2 centuries of war across dozens of worlds, from the ice plains of Fenris, where we had fought alongside the Space Wolves against a dark Eldar raiding party, to the burning deserts of Armageddon, where we had stood in the breach against the green tide of Gazgkul's war, to the void battles in the Damocles Gulf, where we had boarded Tau vessels and cleansed them deck by deck with bolter and blade. I remembered my first campaign, barely a century ago, though it felt like a lifetime, when I had been a scout marine learning the ways of war from veterans who had fought in the Badab War. And I remembered the terror I had felt during that first drop pod assault, the absolute certainty that I was going to die before I ever got the chance to prove myself worthy of the gene seed that had been implanted in my body. I remembered my first kill, a cultist on some forgotten hive world whose name I could no longer recall. Remembered the way his eyes had widened in shock as my combat knife found his throat. Remembered the sick feeling in my stomach that had faded only after my sergeants had assured me that killing in the Emperor's name was not murder, but sacred duty. I remembered my promotion to full battle brother, the ceremony in the chapter's fortress monastery, where the chapter master himself had placed the final piece of power armor on my shoulders and welcomed me into the brotherhood of the Astartes. And I remembered thinking that I would serve until I was old, until I was ancient, until I became one of those gray-haired veterans who trained the next generation and told stories of battles fought before they were born. But I woke, not in the Emperor's presence, but in a tank of amber fluid that smelled of chemicals and recycled biological waste, suspended like a specimen in a tech priest's collection. My body, what remained of it, covered in tubes and wires, and monitoring equipment that beeped and hummed with the rhythm of machines keeping meat alive when meat should have been allowed to fail. I tried to move, but could not. Tried to speak, but discovered that my jaw had been wired shut. Tried to open my eyes fully, but found that my eyelids were held in place by some kind of medical adhesive that prevented me from closing them even when the harsh lumens of the apothecarian became too bright to bear. An apothecary appeared in my limited field of vision, his face obscured by the red lenses of his helmet, and he began to speak in that calm, clinical tone that all apothecaries used when delivering news that would destroy what remained of a brother's life. "Brother Theron," he said, and I recognized the voice as Apothecary Hadrian, who had tended my wounds after the Cronus campaign and who had a reputation for being thorough but not particularly compassionate. "You have sustained injuries that would have killed any other being 3 times over, but your enhanced physiology has kept your vital systems functioning long enough for us to stabilize you." I wanted to ask him why. Why they had bothered. Why they had not simply let me die as I had wanted, but I could make no sound except a wet gurgling that came from somewhere in my ruined chest. He continued as if I had not tried to speak, his voice maintaining that same flat, clinical tone that suggested he had delivered this speech many times before, to many other brothers who had found themselves in similar situations. "Your legs are gone, completely destroyed beyond any hope of regeneration or standard augmetic replacement. Your left arm is similarly lost. Your chest cavity has been compromised to the point where we have had to install temporary life support systems to maintain your heart and lungs, and your spinal column has sustained damage that would leave you paralyzed, even if we could repair the rest." I tried to close my eyes, to retreat into the darkness again, but the adhesive held them open, and I was forced to stare at the apothecary as he delivered my sentence, as he explained in precise medical terminology exactly how broken I was, exactly how far beyond repair my body had been damaged, exactly how little remained of the brother who had charged into that heretic stronghold with his squad at his back and the Emperor's name on his lips. "Under normal circumstances," he said. And I noticed the way he emphasized those words, the way he paused before continuing, as if giving me time to understand that what came next would be anything but normal. "We would extract your gene seed and allow you to pass into the Emperor's care. But the chapter master has other plans for you, Brother Theron, and he will explain them personally when you have stabilized enough to be moved." 3 days passed in the amber tank, 3 days of chemical-induced sleep punctuated by brief periods of awareness during which I could do nothing but stare at the ceiling and contemplate what the chapter master's plans might be. And I knew somewhere in the part of my mind that still functioned clearly despite the drugs and trauma. I knew what they were going to do to me, what they did to brothers who were too damaged to serve in the line but too valuable to simply let die. Though I had never imagined it would happen to me because I was not important enough, not legendary enough, not special enough to deserve the honor and horror of internment within a Dreadnought's sarcophagus. The thought terrified me more than death had, more than the bolt shell that had torn my body apart, because I had heard the stories, had listened to the whispers among the battle brothers about what it was like to be sealed inside a walking tomb, to have your consciousness transferred from flesh to machine, to spend centuries or even millennia trapped in a metal box, with nothing but war and sleep and the gradual erosion of your humanity until you were more machine than man, more weapon than warrior, more relic than living being. Some brothers spoke of it as the highest honor, as a chance to serve the Emperor forever, to become a living legend who walked the battlefield like a god of war. But others, the ones who had been around long enough to see multiple internments, spoke in quieter tones about the price, about the isolation, about the way Dreadnought pilots slowly lost their connection to the world around them, became distant and strange, spoke in archaic dialects and referenced battles that had been fought centuries before anyone listening had been born. The chapter master came on the 4th day, his presence announced by the sudden increase in activity around my tank as apothecaries and servitors rushed to make everything presentable, and when he appeared in my field of vision, I felt something that might have been shame or might have been relief, though the drugs made it difficult to distinguish between emotions. because his face held no joy, no pride, no sense that he was delivering good news to a wounded brother, but rather the grim resignation of a commander who had made a difficult decision and would see it through regardless of the cost. "Brother Theron," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 300 years of service and the weight of decisions that had sent thousands of brothers to their deaths. "You have been chosen for a great honor, though I will not insult you by pretending that it is only an honor and not also a curse, because you deserve honesty after your years of service to the chapter." He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully, weighing each one against the others before committing to a path. And I noticed that he would not meet my eyes directly, would not look at me the way he had looked at me during ceremonies and briefings and the countless other interactions we had shared over my 2 centuries of service. And I understood in that moment that whatever he was about to say would change everything, would transform me from Brother Theron into something else, something that he could no longer look at as a fellow warrior, but only as a tool, a weapon, a necessary evil. "You will be interred within a Leviathan Dreadnought," he said, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence because everyone knew about the Leviathans. Everyone whispered about them when the chapter master was not listening. The ancient machines that stood in the deepest vaults beneath the fortress monastery, too powerful to discard but too dangerous to deploy, except in the most desperate circumstances, the machines that consumed their pilots not slowly like normal dreadnoughts, but quickly, hungrily, adding each new consciousness to the accumulated madness of everyone who had come before. I had seen a Leviathan once. Years ago, during a tour of the chapter's armory when I was still a scout marine learning the history and traditions of the Crimson Templars, and I remembered standing before it in awe and terror, remembered the way it towered over the other dreadnoughts like a giant among children, remembered the warnings etched into its base in High Gothic that spoke of machine spirits that were aggressive and unpredictable, remembered the way the veteran sergeant who was conducting the tour had hurried us past it as if he did not want us to spend too much time in its presence. "They stand empty until direst need," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, dreaded as much as revered, and when I had asked why, if they were so powerful, we did not use them more often, he had looked at me with an expression I could not quite identify at the time, but that I now recognized as pity. And he had said nothing, just shook his head and moved us along to the next display. The chapter master was still speaking, explaining the process, describing what would happen to what remained of my body, outlining the surgery and the integration and the long months of adjustment that would follow, but I barely heard him because my mind was racing with images of that Leviathan in the vault, with memories of the stories I'd heard, with the terrible understanding that I was being given a choice that was not really a choice at all, because the alternative to internment was death, and the chapter did not waste gene seed, did not allow brothers to simply die when they could still serve, no matter the cost to the brother himself. "You will have power beyond imagining," the chapter master said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Power to destroy enemies that would require entire squads to eliminate. Power to turn the tide of battles that would otherwise be lost. Power to serve the Emperor in ways that few brothers ever achieve. But the cost?" He paused again, and in that pause I heard everything he was not saying, everything he could not say without admitting that what he was about to do to me was not entirely for my benefit, but for the chapter's. Not salvation, but sacrifice. Not honor, but necessity. "The cost is that you will burn," he finally said, his voice so quiet that I almost did not hear it over the hum of the machines that kept me alive. "You will burn brightly but briefly in your second life, and the machine will consume you as it has consumed all who came before, and when you are gone, we will find another brother to take your place, and the cycle will continue, because that is what service to the Emperor demands. That is what duty requires. That is the price we pay for the power to defend humanity against the darkness." I tried to speak, tried to beg him to reconsider, tried to ask him to simply extract my gene seed and let me die with whatever dignity remained to me. but my wired jaw would not open, and my paralyzed vocal cords would not vibrate, and all I could manage was a low moan that expressed nothing of what I felt, nothing of the horror and despair and rage that were building in whatever passed for my consciousness in this broken shell of meat and bone. They wheeled me through the fortress monastery on a suspensor gurney that hummed with anti-gravity fields, and I saw brothers turn away as I passed, not out of disgust at my injuries, but out of something worse, out of pity and fear, because they knew where I was going and what awaited me there, and none of them would meet my eyes, even when I tried to catch their attention, tried to communicate through desperate looks that I did not want this, that I would rather die, that they should let me die. Brother Calix was there, the young battle brother who had knelt beside me on the battlefield, and he walked alongside the gurney for a few moments, his hand resting on the edge as if he wanted to offer comfort but did not know how. And when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he was trying hard to suppress. "You will be magnificent, Brother Theron," he said, his words sounding hollow even to my drug-addled consciousness. "You will walk among us as a god of war, and we will sing songs of your deeds for generations to come." But I could see in his eyes that he did not believe what he was saying, that he knew what was really happening to me, that he understood the difference between the glory that came from choosing to serve and the horror that came from having that choice made for you by circumstances beyond your control. The vault was deep, so deep that I lost count of the levels we descended, and the temperature dropped with each level until my breath, what little I could manage through the tubes in my throat, came out in small clouds of vapor that dissipated almost immediately in the recycled air. The walls changed as we descended. From the decorated corridors of the upper fortress, with their murals depicting great battles and honored brothers, to the plain functional passages of the mid-levels where the chapter's machinery and infrastructure were housed, to the bare rock tunnels of the deepest levels where ancient things were stored, things that dated back to the chapter's founding or even earlier, relics from the Great Crusade and the dark age of technology that preceded it, artifacts that were too valuable to destroy, but too dangerous to use except when all other options had been exhausted. The Leviathan stood in a chamber by itself, separated from the other dreadnoughts by thick adamantium doors that bore the seals of the Mechanicus and warnings in High Gothic that I could barely read from my position, but that clearly indicated this was not a normal piece of equipment, not a blessed reliquary like the venerable dreadnoughts that served with honor for thousands of years, but something else, something that required isolation and caution. It was massive, towering over even the Contemptor pattern dreadnoughts that flanked it like honor guards, its armor scarred and pitted from battles I could only imagine, its weapons systems wrapped in blessed oils and suppression fields that suggested they were too powerful to be left active even in storage. And the sarcophagus at its core, the coffin where my body would be sealed, hung open like a mouth waiting to be fed. The interior of the sarcophagus was darker than it should have been, as if the metal itself absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and as I stared at it, I noticed scratches on the inner walls, marks that looked like they had been made by fingers or tools, desperate gouges in the metal that suggested previous occupants had tried to claw their way out, had tried to escape from the prison that would become their eternal home. The nameplate at the base of the sarcophagus had been scraped away, deliberately erased, and I wondered how many names had been etched there over the millennia. How many brothers had been sealed inside this machine? How many had died screaming in the darkness while the machine spirit consumed their consciousness and added it to the choir of voices that whispered in the depths of its systems? The tech marine who would perform the internment was named Xerxes, a brother I had known briefly during the Armageddon Crusade, and he worked with a kind of efficient precision that suggested he had done this before, done it many times, though he would not meet my eyes as he began the process of cutting away what remained of my body and preparing it for integration with the machine. The chapter master watched from the corner of the chamber, his expression unreadable behind the stoic mask that all chapter masters learned to wear. And I wanted to beg him, wanted to plead for mercy, wanted to ask why he would do this to me when I had served faithfully for 2 centuries. But the tubes in my throat prevented speech, and my paralyzed body prevented movement, and all I could do was lie there as they dissected me piece by piece, as they transformed me from a wounded brother into components, into parts that would be installed in a machine like ammunition, loaded into a weapon. They took my remaining arm first, cutting through the shoulder joint with surgical precision and removing the limb entirely because it would not be needed in the Dreadnought's frame. And I felt the loss not as pain. The drugs prevented that, but as a phantom sensation, as if part of my consciousness was still attached to the arm, even as it was carried away by a servitor and placed in a medical waste container. Then they removed what remained of my legs, the stumps that ended just below my hips, and again I felt that phantom sensation, that terrible awareness that pieces of me were being discarded, that I was being reduced to my most essential components, to nothing more than a brain and a few vital organs that would be kept alive by the machine's systems. They began work on my torso next, stripping away damaged tissue and organs, replacing some with augmetic equivalents, and simply discarding others because the Dreadnought would provide the life support functions that kidneys and livers and intestines normally performed. And I watched through drug-hazed eyes as they opened my chest cavity like a book, spreading my ribs apart to allow access to my heart and lungs. And I could see my heart beating, could see the mechanical rhythm of muscle contracting and relaxing, could see the blood flowing through tubes and pumps and filters that kept me alive when my natural systems had been too damaged to function on their own. The mind impulse unit was the worst part, worse than losing my limbs, worse than having my organs removed and replaced, because it required them to cut directly into my brainstem, to install connectors and neural interfaces that would bypass the normal pathways of human consciousness and create a direct link between my thoughts and the machine systems. They kept me conscious through all of it. Conscious because the integration required active neural pathways, required my brain to be functioning normally, or as normally as possible given the circumstances, and I felt every cut, every probe, every connection being made, felt the cold metal sliding into the warm tissue of my brain, felt my consciousness begin to expand beyond the boundaries of my skull as the mind impulse unit established its connections and began mapping my neural patterns onto the machine's control systems. The tech marine worked with mechanical precision, his augmetic hands steady as he guided the delicate instruments through my brain tissue, and he spoke in a low voice to the servitors who assisted him, giving commands in binary cant that I did not understand, but that made the servitors move with synchronized efficiency, passing tools and adjusting equipment and monitoring readouts that displayed information about my vital signs and neural activity. The pain was beyond anything the bolt shell had inflicted, beyond anything I had experienced in 200 years of combat, because this was not the pain of destruction, but the pain of transformation, the pain of having your neural pathways rewired and redirected, the pain of feeling your sense of self expand beyond the boundaries of flesh and into cold metal and blessed machine components. And I would have screamed if I had possessed the ability to scream, would have begged them to stop if I had possessed the ability to beg. But the mind impulse unit had already established its connections, and my thoughts were no longer entirely my own. No longer entirely human, but something hybrid, something caught between flesh and machine. The tech marine stepped back and made the sign of the Aquila, murmuring a prayer to the Omnissiah in High Gothic, and then he activated the final connections, and I felt my consciousness slam into the Dreadnought systems like a bullet hitting armor plate. Felt myself spread out across sensors and weapons and servos and power systems, felt the boundaries of my identity dissolve and reform in a shape that was no longer human but something vast and terrible and powerful. They sealed me into the sarcophagus, and the darkness that closed over me was absolute, total, complete, not the darkness of sleep or death, but the darkness of burial, of being sealed alive in a metal tomb with no hope of escape. And I panicked, thrashed against the restraints that held my limbless torso in place, tried to break free even though I knew there was nowhere to go, no body to return to, nothing outside the sarcophagus except the cold interior of a war machine. The walls of the sarcophagus pressed in around me, close enough that I could feel them with my phantom limbs, close enough that if I had still possessed arms, I could have touched them, and the air inside smelled of metal and oil and something else, something organic and rotten, as if previous occupants had died inside and left their decay embedded in the metal. I tried to breathe, tried to calm myself, tried to remember my training about managing fear and panic in combat situations. But the training assumed you still had a body, still had lungs that could slow their breathing and a heart that could slow its beating. And I had neither, had only the biological remnants that the machines were keeping alive through chemical feeds and electrical stimulation. Then they activated the connection to the atomantic reactor, and everything changed in ways that my human consciousness could not fully process, could not entirely understand, because the power that flowed through the neural connections was not like anything I had experienced before. It was not electricity or chemical energy or any form of power that biological systems were designed to handle, but something older, something that dated back to the dark age of technology when humanity had mastered forces that they barely understood, and had created machines that operated on principles that had been lost during the age of strife. The power surged through my consciousness like lightning through copper wire, burning along pathways that had never been designed to carry such voltages, overwhelming the pain receptors that were already screaming with the agony of transformation. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought my mind would break completely, would shatter like glass under a hammer blow and scatter into a million pieces that could never be reassembled. But the moment passed, and in its place came awareness, not the limited awareness of a human body with its 5 senses and narrow field of perception, but something vast, something that encompassed the entire frame of the Leviathan Dreadnought, every sensor and every weapon system and every armor plate, and every joint and servo, all of it suddenly part of me, suddenly responsive to my thoughts in a way that felt both natural and profoundly wrong. I could feel the weight of my new body, the mass of it, tons of blessed metal and ceramite and adamantium that would have crushed my human form in seconds, but that now responded to mental commands with the same ease that my old body had responded to nerve impulses. I could feel the floor beneath my feet, each individual toe and joint. Could feel the air pressure changes as servitors moved around the chamber. Could feel the electromagnetic radiation from the lumens and the thermal signatures of the living beings who watched my awakening. And the sensory input was overwhelming, was too much for a human consciousness to process, was like trying to drink from a fire hose that sprayed information instead of water. I lifted one arm, the massive siege claw that served as my right hand, and watched through optical sensors that provided vision far clearer than human eyes as it rose into the air. Servos whining with the effort of moving something that weighed more than a standard battle tank. And the power I felt, the sheer physical power, was intoxicating in a way that nothing in my previous life had been. Was like the difference between walking and flying, between speaking and shouting, between being human and being something greater, something that transcended the limitations of flesh and embraced the terrible perfection of the machine. The siege claw opened and closed, each finger massive enough to crush a space marine in full armor, each joint reinforced with adamantium struts and powered by servos that drew energy directly from the reactor, and I experimented with the grip strength. Found that I could modulate it from gentle enough to pick up small objects to strong enough to tear through tank armor like wet paper. But there was something else, something at the edges of my new awareness. Not quite voices, but impressions, emotions, fragments of thought that seemed to come from somewhere other than my own mind. And when I tried to focus on them, they scattered like insects exposed to light, retreating into the deeper systems of the machine where I could not follow. The sensation was like hearing whispers in an empty room, like seeing movement in your peripheral vision that disappeared when you turned to look directly at it. and it filled me with a dread that the power and the euphoria could not quite overcome. Because I knew, somewhere in the part of my consciousness that still remembered being Brother Theron, that those whispers were not random system noise or feedback from the neural connections, but something else. Something that lived in the machine systems and waited for me to weaken so it could begin the process of consumption that the chapter master had warned me about. The tech marine was speaking, his voice transmitted directly into my mind through the sarcophagus's Vox systems, bypassing my non-existent ears and speaking directly to the auditory processing centers of my brain, and he was saying something about machine-spirit compatibility and integration. Success rates, but I barely heard him because I was too busy trying to understand what I had become, trying to reconcile the vast power I now possessed with the absolute helplessness of my position, trapped forever in a metal box with no hands to touch with, no legs to walk with, no mouth to speak with except through the modulated Vox system that turned my thoughts into mechanical booms that echoed through the vault chamber. I tried to speak, tried to form words, tried to ask the questions that burned in my consciousness, but what came out of the Vox speakers was not language, but a distorted howl of static and feedback that made the servitors freeze in place, and the tech marine take an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively to the power axe at his belt, as if preparing to defend himself against an enemy that he could not see but could clearly sense. "Brother Theron," the tech marine said, his voice carrying a note of concern that cut through my confusion, "you must remain calm. The machine spirit is particularly aggressive in this frame, and any emotional instability on your part will make the integration more difficult. You must center yourself, must find the balance between your consciousness and the machine systems, must learn to distinguish between your thoughts and the impressions that the machine spirit provides." I tried to ask what he meant by aggressive, tried to ask how many pilots had been in this frame before me, tried to ask what had happened to them, but my thoughts came out as distorted static through the Vox speakers, and the tech marine exchanged a look with the chapter master that told me everything I needed to know, told me that this was not the first time they had sealed a brother into this cursed machine, told me that whatever was waiting for me in the depths of the Leviathan systems had consumed others before me and would consume me too if I was not strong enough to resist, told me that the chapter master's warnings about burning brightly but briefly had not been metaphorical but literal, that I would be used up like fuel in a furnace, burned until there was nothing left but ash and echoes. The chapter master approached, his footsteps heavy in the silence that followed my distorted Vox output, and he stood before me, looking up at my optical sensors with an expression that mixed authority and pity in equal measures. "You will learn control, Brother Theron," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You will master the machine spirit as you once mastered your power armor and your bolter. It will take time, and the process will not be pleasant, but you will succeed because failure is not an option, because the chapter needs you, because the Emperor demands your service regardless of the cost." I wanted to tell him that I had never chosen this, that the choice between death and internment was not really a choice at all when one option was forced upon me by circumstance and the other was denied by chapter doctrine. I wanted to tell him that service should not require the complete destruction of everything that made me human, should not demand that I burn myself out like a candle in a windstorm just to provide a few months of tactical advantage on battlefields I could barely comprehend. But the words would not come, the Vox system would not translate my thoughts into language, and all I could do was stand there in my towering frame and radiate the helpless rage that was building in my consciousness, like pressure in a sealed container. They left me in the vault chamber, alone in the darkness with nothing but the reactor's pulse and my own thoughts, and I tried to feel my body, tried to remember what it had been like to have hands and feet and a chest that rose and fell with each breath, but the memories were already fading, already being replaced by the reality of sensor feeds and weapon systems and armor integrity reports that flowed through my consciousness like a river of data. I focused on my hands first, trying to remember the sensation of fingers closing around a bolter's grip, the texture of ceramite against skin, the weight of a weapon that I had carried for 2 centuries, but the phantom sensations were weak, were growing weaker with each passing moment, being overwritten by the reality of siege claws and gravflux bombards and weapon systems that I had never trained to use, but that my consciousness now understood with an intimacy that exceeded anything I had achieved with conventional weapons. My heart, what remained of it, beat in time with the reactor's pulse. Or perhaps the reactor pulsed in time with my heart, I could not tell which, and the distinction seemed less important with each passing moment, as if the boundary between biological and mechanical was becoming less defined, less relevant, less something that mattered in the face of the vast power that thrummed through my new form. Sleep came, or what passed for sleep in a dreadnought. A kind of enforced stasis that shut down non-essential systems and reduced consciousness to a dim awareness of time passing. But even in stasis, I could hear them, the whispers, not words exactly, but impressions of words, ancient and angry and hungry, speaking in a language I should not have understood but did, speaking of betrayal and loss and rage that had burned for 10,000 years without diminishing. And I tried to shut them out, tried to retreat into the deepest parts of my consciousness where they could not reach me, but they were everywhere, were embedded in the machine systems like malware in a cogitator. And there was no escape from them, no safe place where I could hide from the accumulated madness of everyone who had come before me. The dreams began that first night. Dreams of battles I had never fought, of worlds I had never visited, of enemies I had never faced, and I experienced them not as distant memories, but as immediate reality, as if I was living through them in real time, feeling every sensation, every emotion, every agonizing moment of defeat and death that had scarred the consciousness of the machine's previous occupants. I saw Istvan III through someone else's eyes, saw the virus bombs fall like rain from the infected sky, saw the surface of the planet erupt in sheets of flame that consumed everything they touched, turning forests into ash and oceans into steam and cities into craters of molten rock. And I felt the betrayal, felt it like a knife twisting in my guts even though I had no guts anymore, felt the absolute incomprehensible horror of watching brothers turn on brothers, of seeing Astartes in the colors of the Emperor's children and World Eaters and Death God, fire upon loyalists who had served beside them for decades, who had fought and bled and died beside them in the Emperor's name. And I felt the rage, felt it building like pressure in a sealed container, felt it burning in a way that the reactor's power could not match. And I understood in that moment that this was not just a dream, not just a memory fragment that had somehow survived in the machine's databanks, but something else. Something that was part of the machine spirit itself. Something that had shaped its nature and would now shape mine. The voice that belonged to the eyes I was seeing through was not my voice, was deeper and older, and filled with a bitter hatred that made my own rage seem like a child's tantrum, and it spoke in High Gothic that had been ancient even during the Horus Heresy, spoke words of vengeance and justice and retribution that would echo through the millennia, spoke vows that would never be fulfilled because the targets of that vengeance were long dead or had ascended to demonhood beyond the reach of mortal weapons. Brother Gorvin, that was the name, the first pilot, the one who had survived the heresy and whose consciousness had infected the machine spirit like a virus, and I could feel him in the depths of the systems, could sense his presence as clearly as I could sense my own, and he was not dead, not erased, not gone, but waiting, patient and hungry, waiting for the next weak moment, the next gap in my defenses, the next opportunity to pour his hatred and madness into my consciousness and remake me in his image. I tried to wake, tried to pull myself out of the dream before it consumed me entirely, but the stasis held me locked in place, and all I could do was experience, was witness, was live through the aftermath of Istvan as Gorvin and his brothers had lived through it, fighting their way off the burning world, leaving behind thousands of loyalists who had trusted them and who had been rewarded with betrayal and death. I felt Gorvan's rage grow with each battle, felt it feed on every traitor he killed, felt it become something more than mere anger, more than simple hatred, becoming a fundamental part of his identity, replacing everything else, consuming every other emotion until only the rage remained, pure and perfect and absolute. And I understood with growing horror that this was my future, that this was what awaited me at the end of my service in the Leviathan. Not death, but dissolution, not destruction, but transformation into something that was no longer human, no longer even Astartes, but simply rage, given form, hatred made manifest in metal and circuits and the burning core of an atomantic reactor. I woke screaming, or trying to scream, my Vox system broadcasting a howl of distorted static that echoed through the vault chamber and brought tech marines running from their workshops, their weapons drawn and their sensors active as they scanned for threats that did not exist except in my consciousness. They checked my systems, ran diagnostics on my neural connections, examined the reactor's output levels and the integrity of the sarcophagus seals, and they found nothing wrong, nothing that could explain the scream, nothing that suggested any malfunction or damage to the machine systems. Everything is within normal parameters. One of them reported to the others, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone reading from a data slate. Reactor output is stable. Neural integration is proceeding as expected. Machine spirit activity is elevated, but not beyond acceptable ranges for a new integration. They left after a final check of my systems, and I was alone again in the darkness, with nothing but the reactor's pulse and the whispers that grew louder each time I tried to sleep. Each time I let my consciousness relax enough to slip into that dangerous state between waking and stasis, where the machine spirit could reach me, could touch me, could begin the slow process of consumption that would eventually replace everything I was with, everything they had been. The first deployment came 3 months later, 3 months of adjustment and training during which I learned to walk in my new body, learned to coordinate the movements of legs that weighed tons each and arms that could crush battle tanks as easily as I had once crushed insects, learned to aim and fire weapon systems that drew power directly from the reactor and that delivered devastation on a scale that made my old bolter seem like a child's toy. The training took place in a specially constructed chamber deep in the fortress monastery, a vast space with reinforced walls and ceiling that could theoretically withstand the full output of my weapons, though I noticed that the tech marines who supervised my training always positioned themselves behind blast shields, and that servitors were used to set up the training targets rather than actual battle brothers who might be damaged if I lost control. I learned to walk first, each step a deliberate act of will that required me to calculate weight distribution and momentum and a dozen other factors that my human body had handled automatically through muscle memory and biological feedback loops, and the first few attempts were disasters, were stumbling lurches that nearly sent me crashing to the floor and would have done so if not for the stabilizing systems built into the frame that compensated for my inexperience. I learned to turn next, discovered that moving a body that weighed dozens of tons required planning and patience because inertia was not something that could be easily overcome. Discovered that quick movements were impossible without tearing up the floor beneath my feet or losing balance entirely. Discovered that the Leviathan was built for power rather than speed, for devastating firepower rather than tactical flexibility, for standing in the breach and absorbing punishment while dealing out destruction in return. The weapons training came last, and it was here that I began to understand the true nature of what I had become, began to comprehend the scale of destruction I could cause with a single thought transmitted through the neural connections to the weapon systems. The Gravflux Bombard was my primary weapon, mounted on my left arm where a normal Dreadnought might carry a storm bolter or assault cannon. And when the tech marine first activated it for testing, I felt the power build in the weapon's coils, felt reality itself begin to bend and warp around the barrel as gravitational forces that should not have been possible in normal space accumulated and prepared to release. Fire when ready. the tech marine instructed. And I did. I pulled the metaphorical trigger that was actually just a thought transmitted through neural pathways to the weapon's control systems, and the world exploded in a wave of gravitational distortion that picked up everything in front of me and compressed it into a singularity point that collapsed under its own weight. The training targets, reinforced adamantium blocks that were designed to withstand direct hits from battle cannons, simply ceased to exist, crushed out of existence by forces that multiplied local gravity by factors I could not calculate, and I felt the satisfaction, felt it bloom in my consciousness like a flower opening to the sun, felt it mix with the power high that came from channeling that much energy through my systems. And I wanted more, wanted to fire again and again until nothing remained standing in the training chamber, and it took effort, real effort, to resist the urge, to pull back from the precipice of that desire and remember that I was supposed to be learning control rather than simply indulging in destruction. The tech marine noticed my hesitation, noticed the way my frame trembled with barely restrained power, and he spoke in a calm voice that cut through the reactor's roar and the weapon's residual hum. "That is the machine spirit's influence, Brother Theron," he said. "That desire to continue firing, to keep killing, to feed on destruction until nothing remains. You must resist it, must remember that you are the pilot, not the machine, that your consciousness controls the frame rather than being controlled by it." But even as he spoke, I could feel the lie in his words, could sense that he did not entirely believe what he was saying, that he knew from experience or from reports or from the whispered conversations among tech marines that the line between pilot and machine was not as clear as he made it sound, that the integration was not a partnership but a slow absorption, not cooperation but consumption. The orc war that threatened the hive world of Tertius Prime had been growing for weeks, spreading across the planet's surface like a green cancer, consuming everything in its path and growing stronger with each victory. And the Imperial Guard regiments that had been defending the planet were slowly being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the greenskins and by the crude but effective technology they brought to bear. The chapter had been called in to reinforce the defenders, to provide the shock troops and elite forces that could turn the tide of battles that were otherwise lost. And the chapter master had decided that this would be my baptism, my first taste of combat in the Leviathan's frame, my opportunity to prove that the investment in my internment had been worthwhile. They loaded me into a drop pod that had been specifically modified to accommodate a Leviathan chassis, a massive reinforced container that was barely large enough to fit my frame even when I was locked into the deployment position with my limbs compressed against my torso and my weapon systems deactivated, and the space inside was so tight that I could feel the walls pressing against my armor plating, creating a sensation not unlike being buried alive, despite the fact that I was technically already buried alive inside the sarcophagus itself. The other battle brothers who would be deployed alongside me were loaded into their own drop pods, standard issue containers designed for regular Astartes, and I listened to their vox chatter as we waited for launch, listened to their prayers and battle hymns and last-minute equipment checks, and I felt simultaneously connected to them and utterly isolated from them, because while we were all going to the same battlefield, while we would all fight the same enemies and serve the same emperor, I was no longer really one of them, was no longer a battle brother in the sense that they understood the term, but something else, something that existed adjacent to their reality rather than fully part of it. The launch came without warning, just a sudden, massive acceleration that slammed me against the restraints with enough force to have killed a normal human, and that even my enhanced consciousness found disorienting. And then we were falling through the atmosphere toward the planet's surface, and the heat of re-entry turned the interior of the drop pod into an oven that would have cooked flesh in seconds, but that my armor barely registered, just another data point in the constant stream of information that flowed through my consciousness. The descent was violent, brutally violent, the drop pod shaking and rattling as it cut through the atmosphere at speeds that exceeded anything my human body had ever experienced, and I could feel every vibration, every impact, every adjustment of the steering thrusters, could feel the ablative shielding burning away as friction converted our kinetic energy into heat. Could feel the servitors aboard the drop pod making constant micro-adjustments to keep us on course toward the designated landing zone. Through the external sensors, I caught glimpses of the planet below, saw vast stretches of burning landscape where the orcs had already passed, saw the hive cities in the distance still standing but surrounded by green tides that pressed against their walls, like ocean waves against cliffs, saw the smoke and fire and devastation that marked the Waa's progress across the world, and I felt anticipation building in my consciousness, anticipation that was not entirely my own, but that came from somewhere deeper, from the machine spirit that hungered for battle, that wanted to feel the satisfaction of destruction, that had been waiting in the vault's darkness for months while I learned control, and now wanted to be unleashed. I hit the ground with an impact that left a crater 3 meters deep and sent shockwaves through the surrounding earth strong enough to knock nearby orcs off their feet. And before the dust had even settled, I was moving, the restraints releasing automatically as the drop pod's walls fell away in pre-programmed sequence. And I took my first step onto the battlefield, felt my weight compress the soil into something like stone, felt the power coursing through my frame as systems that had been dormant during transit activated and came online. The orcs saw me coming. Of course they saw me coming. I was impossible to miss, a towering war machine advancing through their lines with the inevitable certainty of an avalanche or an earthquake or some other natural disaster that could not be stopped or reasoned with but only endured. And they did what orcs always did when confronted with something larger and more dangerous than themselves. They charged, howling their crude battle cries in voices that sounded almost like laughter, firing their equally crude weapons that pinged harmlessly off my armor plating or were absorbed by the atomantic shields that flickered into existence whenever the targeting systems detected incoming fire. My first kill came when a mob of orc boys tried to overwhelm me through sheer numbers, thinking perhaps that they could climb my frame and tear me apart with their crude choppers and shooters the way they might tear apart a vehicle or building, and I activated the grav flux bombard mounted on my left arm, not really understanding on a conscious level what it would do, not really comprehending the physics involved or the technology that made it possible, just knowing that the weapon system was charged and ready, and that I needed to eliminate the threat before it became a problem. The gravitational waves that erupted from the weapon's barrel were invisible to normal sight, but my enhanced sensors tracked them as they spread outward in expanding spheres, and their effects were immediately horrifically visible as the orcs closest to me simply compressed, their bodies crushed by forces that multiplied local gravity by factors of hundreds or thousands, reducing flesh and bone and crude armor to dense spheres of matter roughly the size of my fist that fell to the ground, with wet thuds that I could feel through my seismic sensors. The orcs behind them fared no better, caught in the expanding wave of gravitational distortion that picked them up and hurled them against each other, with enough force to rupture organs and break bones and turn their crude weapons into shrapnel that killed their own comrades. And by the time the weapon powered down for its recycling cycle, there were no living orcs within 50 meters of my position, just corpses, and the moaning wounded who would not survive long enough for medical attention, and the ones who had broken and run when they realized that this was not a fight they could win, that this was not like fighting Imperial Guard soldiers who could be overwhelmed through numbers and aggression, but something else entirely, something that existed on a different scale of destruction. The sensation of power, of absolute devastating power, concentrated in a single frame, was unlike anything I had experienced in my 200 years as a battle brother. Because even in power armor, with a bolter in my hands, I had always been vulnerable, always aware that a lucky shot or a well-placed blade could end my existence, could reduce me from a warrior of the Emperor to a corpse waiting for gene seed extraction. But here, now, in the Leviathan's frame, I felt invincible. Felt like nothing in the Orc horde could harm me. Felt like I could walk through the entire war without sustaining more than superficial damage to my outermost armor plates. I advanced deeper into their lines, each step crushing Orcs beneath my feet when they were too slow to move, my siege claw cutting others in half when they got close enough to think they had a chance, the powered blades that lined its fingers, slicing through their crude armor and thick muscles as easily as I had once cut through cultist robes. And I fired the grav flux bombard again and again as soon as the recycling cycle completed, each shot eliminating dozens of enemies, each discharge of gravitational force carving corridors of compressed corpses through the green tide. The battle lasted hours, though time had become strange in the Leviathan, flowing differently than it had in my human body, stretching out during moments of intense combat, when every second contained dozens of decisions, and compressed during the intervals between engagements when there was nothing to do but walk across the battlefield toward the next concentration of enemies. The other battle brothers fought alongside me, their red armor bright against the dull green of the Orc horde, and I could hear their vox chatter, could hear them calling out targets and coordinates and warnings about enemy concentrations, and I tried to respond, tried to participate in the tactical coordination that I had spent 2 centuries learning, but my consciousness was too busy processing the overwhelming flood of sensory data and weapon system information to spare much attention for communication, and what few Vox transmissions I managed were distorted and unclear, my thoughts not quite translating properly into the modulated signals that the Vox system produced. When it was finally over, when the last Orc had been killed or driven off or had simply broken and fled into the wilderness where Imperial Guard units would hunt them down over the following months, I stood in the center of what had been a battlefield and was now a charnel house. Surrounded by the evidence of my destructive capabilities, surrounded by thousands of corpses in various states of compression and dismemberment, surrounded by craters where my gravflux bombard had warped reality itself, and I felt, not horror at what I had done, not remorse for the scale of the killing, even though these had been Xenos and deserved no mercy, but satisfaction, deep and profound satisfaction that transcended anything I had felt during my previous service. Satisfaction that came not just from having served the Emperor well, but from having exercised power on a scale that few beings in the galaxy could match, from having been, for those few hours of combat, something close to a god of war. But as the battle high faded and my systems began to cool and the adrenaline-equivalent chemicals that my remaining biological components had been producing started to break down, I noticed something else. Something that had been present during the battle, but that I had attributed to the stress of combat, a voice at the edge of my consciousness that was not my voice, not the Tech Marine's instructions transmitted through the Vox system, not the Battle Brothers' coordination chatter, but something older, something that whispered approval and satisfaction and hunger for more. The machine spirit, I thought, just the machine spirit reacting to the battle, to the destruction, to the exercise of the power that it was designed to project. But even as I thought it, I knew the explanation was insufficient. Knew that what I was experiencing was not some simple programmed response, but something else, something that possessed intention and awareness and desires that were separate from my own. They returned me to the fortress monastery in a heavy lifter that groaned under my weight, and the other battle brothers who had fought alongside me maintained a careful distance, their body language suggesting not respect but wariness, as if they had seen something during the battle that concerned them, as if my performance had been not just effective but excessive in ways that made them uncomfortable. The chapter master met me when the lifter landed, his face grave behind his helmet's faceplate, and he watched in silence as the tech marines initiated the shutdown sequence, as my consciousness began to dim and my systems began to deactivate for the return to the vault. And I tried to ask him if I'd performed adequately, if my service had justified the chapter's decision to enter me in this cursed machine, but the words would not come through the Vox system, and all I could manage was a burst of static that made him frown and turn away. When they initiated the stasis protocols, when my consciousness began to dim and slip into that dangerous state between waking and sleep, where the whispers grew louder, I felt it clearly for the first time, felt the presence that inhabited the machine systems reach out and touch my mind with something that might have been approval, or might have been hunger, or might have been both. The voice that came through was not words, but impressions, fragments of thought that conveyed meaning without language. And what they conveyed was satisfaction, pleasure at the destruction I'd caused, happiness at the power I had exercised, eagerness for the next deployment when I could kill again, when the Gravflux bombard could compress more flesh into dense spheres, when the Siege Claw could tear through more armor and more bodies. And I understood, with growing horror, that the machine spirit was not just aggressive or unpredictable as the tech marines had warned, but actively malevolent, actively working to shape my consciousness in its own image, to remake me into something that existed only to kill, only to destroy, only to feed the hunger that had been growing in these systems for 10,000 years. The dreams returned stronger than before, more vivid, more detailed, more real in ways that made it difficult to distinguish them from actual memories. And I lived through battles that I had never fought, experienced defeats and victories that belonged to pilots who had died centuries or millennia before my birth, felt emotions that were not my own, but that became part of me anyway through the process of experiencing them. I saw the later stages of the Horus heresy through Gorvan's eyes, saw the Emperor's children fall completely to Slanesh's corruption, their armor painted in garish colors and their weapons modified with blades and hooks designed to cause maximum pain rather than clean kills. And I felt Gorvan's rage intensify, felt it become something transcendent, something that exceeded mere hatred and became a fundamental force that shaped his every action, his every thought, his every moment of consciousness. I experienced his battles on Terra itself during the final siege, experienced the desperate fighting in the Imperial Palace as traitor legions pushed toward the Sanctum Imperialis, and loyalist defenders threw themselves against the tide knowing they would die, but that their deaths might buy precious seconds for the Emperor to complete whatever plan he had for ending the heresy. I felt Gorvan's joy, yes joy, at finally having targets worthy of his rage, at finally being able to kill traitors who wore the colors he hated most, at finally having the opportunity to take revenge for brothers who had died on Istvan and a dozen other worlds where betrayal had struck without warning, and I felt the intoxication of that killing, felt the way it fed his rage rather than sating it, felt the way each traitor's death only made him hunger for more, made him push deeper into the traitor lines, made him continue fighting long after tactical wisdom would have suggested withdrawal. I saw through his sensors as a noise marine fired a sonic weapon directly at his chassis, saw the reality warping effects of the sound waves as they tore through armor that had been designed to withstand conventional weapons, felt the damage cascade through his systems as joints seized and armor plating cracked and one of his weapon arms was torn completely away. And I felt not fear or concern, but only rage. Rage that the traitor had dared to damage his frame, rage that his capacity to kill had been reduced, rage that screamed for vengeance at any cost. He charged the noise marine despite his damaged systems, despite the tactical stupidity of closing with an enemy who had already proven capable of harming him, despite the fact that other targets were available that could be engaged from range. And he crushed the traitor beneath his remaining arm, crushed him slowly and deliberately while the noise marine screamed through his helmet's Vox grill. And I felt Gorvan's satisfaction at that scream, felt the way it fed something in him that had nothing to do with duty or service to the Emperor, but was purely about causing pain, about inflicting suffering on those who had betrayed the Imperium. The dream shifted, compressed time in the way that dreams do, and I was experiencing Gorvin's final battle. The one that should have killed him but somehow did not. The one where he pushed too far and fought too long and sustained damage that even a Leviathan chassis could not absorb. Traitor Titans had entered the battlefield, war machines that dwarfed even his massive frame, and he had engaged them despite standing orders to withdraw in the face of such overwhelming firepower, and I felt the atomantic reactor strain as it poured power into failing systems, felt the heat building in the sarcophagus as cooling systems were damaged and could no longer adequately regulate temperature, felt Gorvin's consciousness begin to fragment under the combined stress of physical damage and neural overload, but through it all, the rage remained, burning hotter than the reactor, consuming everything else, becoming the only thing that mattered, the only thing that kept him functional when his body should have shut down and his consciousness should have collapsed. And then, at the moment when death should have claimed him, when the damage should have been too severe to survive, I felt something else happen, felt his consciousness begin to pour out of his dying body and into the machine systems themselves. Not as data to be stored, but as living awareness, as genuine consciousness that embedded itself in the circuits and processes and databanks that became part of the machine spirit, not as programming, but as genuine intelligence, as a ghost haunting its own tomb. I felt him spread through the Leviathan systems like an infection, felt him imprint his rage and his hatred and his hunger for destruction onto the fundamental architecture of the machine, felt him become something that was no longer human or even post-human, but purely machine, purely digital, purely immortal in a way that biological beings could never achieve. I woke screaming again, and this time the tech marines did not come running, as if they had grown accustomed to my night terrors, as if this was expected behavior for a Leviathan pilot, as if everyone who had come before me had gone through the same process, and the tech marines had learned that there was nothing they could do except wait for it to pass. I lay in the darkness with the reactor's pulse hammering through my systems and Gorvin's voice whispering at the edges of my consciousness, and I tried to remember who I was, tried to hold on to the identity of Brother Theron of the Crimson Templars, tried to recall the battles I had fought and the brothers I had served with and the beliefs that had sustained me through 2 centuries of war, but the memories were slipping away, fading like dreams upon waking, being overwritten by older memories, darker memories. Memories that belonged to Gorvin and Multh and Vakarian and all the others who had been consumed before me. The second deployment came sooner than I expected, just 6 weeks after the first, as if the chapter master wanted to use me while I was still functional, while the integration was still proceeding acceptably, before the inevitable deterioration that claimed all Leviathan pilots made me too dangerous to deploy. This time, we were facing a chaos cult uprising on a civilized world where the civilians had turned against the Imperium and embraced the ruinous powers, where mutation and madness had spread through the population like a plague, where the governor himself had declared independence from Terra and sworn allegiance to the dark gods. And the chapter master's orders were clear: eliminate all resistance, leave no cultist alive, purge the taint of chaos with fire and fury, and show no mercy, because mercy was what allowed chaos to take root in the first place. Mercy was weakness. Mercy was the crack in armor through which corruption entered, and we would show them what happened to those who betrayed the Emperor and embraced the darkness. The battle should have been straightforward, should have been a simple matter of identifying targets and eliminating them with maximum efficiency, coordinating with the other elements of the strike force to suppress resistance and secure key locations before the cult could organize a coherent defense. But something went wrong. Something inside me that I could not control, could not resist, could not even fully understand, because it came not from my conscious thoughts, but from somewhere deeper, from the place where Gorvin's voice whispered and the machine spirit's hunger grew. because as soon as I saw the cultists with their crude symbols painted on their flesh and their makeshift weapons cobbled together from farming tools and industrial equipment, and their pathetic attempts at channeling warp energies through rituals they barely understood, the rage that had been building in the depths of the Leviathan systems broke free and consumed me. I did not fight tactically, did not coordinate with my battle brothers, did not follow the careful plans that the chapter master had laid out for the operation. I just killed, fired my weapons into crowds of cultists until there was nothing left but burning corpses and shattered buildings, crushed fleeing civilians beneath my feet, because in that moment I could not distinguish between guilty and innocent, between cultist and victim, between those who had chosen corruption willingly and those who had been forced or tricked or corrupted against their will. My siege claw tore through walls and vehicles and human bodies with equal ease, and my gravflux bombard turned entire city blocks into zones of gravitational chaos, where reality itself seemed to bend and compress and stretch in ways that defied physical laws, where buildings collapsed not from structural damage, but from localized changes in how gravity functioned, where people died not from wounds, but from having their internal organs compressed or their bodies stretched beyond the point where biological systems could function. And I was aware, distantly aware, that what I was doing was wrong, was excessive, was exactly the kind of indiscriminate slaughter that the Codex Astartes warned against, that this level of destruction would make it impossible to pacify the world afterward, because you cannot pacify the dead, cannot rebuild what has been so thoroughly destroyed that no foundations remain, cannot win hearts and minds when you have burned the hearts and crushed the minds. But I could not stop, could not control my actions, because they were not entirely my actions, because something else was moving my weapons, guiding my steps, making decisions that I would never have made if I had been in full control of my faculties. Gorvan's voice was loud now, no longer a whisper, but a shout that drowned out my own thoughts, that filled my consciousness with memories of Istvan and betrayal and the absolute necessity of killing every last traitor before they could spread their corruption further. And I understood that he was seeing not cultists, but Emperor's children, not this world, but Istvan, not the present, but the past, and I was simply the vehicle through which he could continue his war, could continue his vengeance, could continue killing the enemies who had betrayed him 10,000 years ago. The other battle brothers tried to intervene, tried to pull me back from the worst of the civilian concentrations, tried to redirect my attention toward confirmed cult strongholds, rather than residential districts where the guilt of the inhabitants was uncertain. But I could not hear them, or I heard them, but could not process their words as anything other than noise, as interference in the signal that carried Gorvan's commands from the depths of the machine spirit into my consciousness and out through my weapon systems. I turned on them briefly, my targeting systems locking onto their red armor, my weapons cycling to firing status, and only a desperate emergency override transmitted by the chapter master himself through priority command channels that bypassed my conscious mind and went straight to the Leviathan's core. Systems prevented me from committing fratricide, from killing my own brothers because Gorvan's memories told me they were traitors, told me they wore the wrong colors, told me they needed to die. The shutdown was not gentle, not the normal stasis sequence that allowed for gradual system deactivation, but an emergency protocol that simply cut power to non-essential systems and forced my consciousness into dormancy like flipping a switch. And my last thought before the darkness claimed me was a question about how many more times I would be allowed to wake, how many more deployments I could survive before the chapter master decided that I was too dangerous to use, that the tactical advantage I provided was outweighed by the risk I posed to friendly forces, that it was time to do to me what had been done to Vicarian and Malth and all the others who had come before. Time to destroy the machine and add my consciousness to the choir of voices that screamed in its depths. When I woke, the chapter master was standing in front of me, and his expression was not one of anger or disappointment, but of grim confirmation, as if he had expected this, as if this was how all Leviathan pilots behaved eventually, as if the loss of control was not a failure on my part, but a feature of the machine itself. Something that could be managed but never eliminated. Something that was built into the fundamental nature of the Leviathan design because the power came at a cost, and the cost was the pilot's sanity. "Brother Theron," he said, his voice calm and measured despite what I had done. Despite the fact that I had nearly killed my own brothers and had certainly killed thousands of civilians who might not have deserved death. "You must learn to distinguish between the machine spirit's impulses and your own. Must learn to resist the urges that the Leviathan imparts. Must find a way to maintain control even when the rage threatens to overwhelm you. Because if you cannot control yourself, you will become useless to the chapter. And if you become useless, we will be forced to take measures that neither of us desires." I wanted to tell him that I had tried to resist, that I had fought against the rage with every fragment of consciousness I possessed, that the battle for control had been as intense as the battle against the cultists, that Gorvan's voice had been so loud and so compelling that resisting it had been like trying to swim against a riptide or run through quicksand, that every moment of control had required more effort than any battle I had fought in 2 centuries as a regular battle brother. But my Vox systems were still not fully under my control, and what came out was a garbled mess of static and distorted words that barely approximated human speech, that sounded more like screaming than language, that conveyed emotion but not meaning. He watched me struggle for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he turned and left without another word. And I was alone again in the darkness, with nothing but the reactor's pulse and the whispers that grew louder with each passing day, with Gorvan's voice telling me that I was weak, that I was failing, that I lacked the strength to wield the power I had been given, that I should stop resisting and simply accept what I was becoming, accept the rage, accept the hunger, accept the dissolution of whatever remained of Brother Theron, and the emergence of something new, something that was part Theron and part Gorvan and part all the other pilots who had been consumed. A Gestalt consciousness that existed only to kill. The isolation between deployments was worse than combat, worse than the pain of transformation, worse than anything except perhaps the dreams, because in the vault I had nothing to focus on except my own dissolution, nothing to distract me from the realization that I was losing myself piece by piece, memory by memory, thought by thought, to the machine that hosted my consciousness. The stasis should have brought peace, should have been a mercy that allowed me to skip through time without awareness, without experiencing the slow erosion of my identity, but instead it brought nightmares, brought visions of ancient battles and ancient hatreds, brought the accumulated trauma of dozens of pilots who had come before me and who had left their suffering imprinted on the machine spirit like scars on flesh, like data carved into storage media, like memories burned into neural tissue that could never be erased. I tried to hold on to my identity, tried to remember who I had been, tried to recall my name and my history and the brothers I had served with and the campaigns I had fought, but the memories were slipping away, fading like dreams upon waking, replaced by older memories that belonged to someone else, someone who had fought at Istvan and survived, someone who had watched the Emperor's children fall to corruption, someone whose rage at the betrayal had burned so hot that it had seared itself into the very fabric of the machine, had become part of its fundamental nature, had infected every system and every circuit and every processor with hatred so pure that it transcended individual consciousness and became something collective, something shared among all the pilots who had been consumed. Brother Gorvan, that was his name. The first pilot, the one who had survived the Horus heresy and whose consciousness formed the core of the machine spirit's malevolence. And I could feel him in the depths of the systems, could sense his presence like a shadow cast by a light I could not see, could hear his thoughts as clearly as my own thoughts, could no longer distinguish where he ended and I began, and he was waiting, patient and hungry, waiting for me to weaken, waiting for me to lower my guard, waiting for the moment when he could pour his hatred and madness into the gaps in my consciousness and replace me entirely, not killing me but absorbing me, adding my experiences and my suffering to his own, making me part of the collective horror that was the Leviathan's machine spirit. The tech marines came sometimes to check on me, to run diagnostics and perform maintenance, and I tried to speak to them, tried to make them understand what was happening to me, tried to beg them to stay longer because their presence, their human presence, was the only thing that kept the whispers at bay, was the only thing that reminded me that there was a world outside the machine, outside the madness, outside the endless cycle of rage and killing and dissolution. But they were afraid. I could see it in their body language, in the way they hurried through their work and avoided looking at my optical sensors directly, in the way they whispered to each other in binary cant, that they thought I could not understand, but that my enhanced systems translated automatically, and what they whispered was not reassuring, was not hopeful, was simply clinical observations about deterioration rates and integration failure patterns and estimated time until terminal cognitive collapse. One of them, a young brother I did not recognize, his face still unmarked by the scars and augmentations that older tech marines accumulated over decades of service, whispered to his companion something that I was not supposed to hear, but that my augmented senses picked up anyway, his voice barely above a breath, but perfectly clear to sensors that could track a bolter shell in flight. 3 months, he said, his tone mixing fascination and horror in equal measures. Same as the last one. Same as all of them, actually. Always 3 months before the deterioration becomes obvious, before they start mistaking present for past, before the rage takes over completely and they become too dangerous to deploy. I tried to ask what he meant, tried to demand answers about the pilots who had come before me, about how many there had been and what had happened to them and whether any of them had ever managed to retain their identity or whether consumption was inevitable, but they left before I could formulate the words, hurrying from the vault chamber as if afraid that remaining too long in my presence might somehow contaminate them, might expose them to whatever madness had infected me. And I was alone again with the terrible knowledge that my suffering was not unique, was not special, was simply the latest iteration of a cycle that had been repeating for millennia, that the chapter knew exactly what was happening to me, because they had seen it happen dozens or hundreds of times before, that they understood the deterioration pattern and the timeline and the inevitable conclusion, and they used me anyway, deployed me anyway, consumed me anyway because the tactical advantage was worth the cost, because one brother's sanity was a small price to pay for the firepower that could turn battles, because the Imperium had always measured value in terms of output rather than suffering, in terms of results rather than cost, in terms of victory rather than the human price of achieving it. The third deployment came, and it should have been routine, should have been a simple orc suppression mission on the outskirts of an agri-world where a small Wa was threatening the food production facilities that supplied an entire subsector, but by then I was no longer capable of routine, no longer capable of following simple orders, because the boundary between myself and the machine had eroded to the point where I could not reliably determine which thoughts were mine and which thoughts were echoes from the pilots who had come before, which emotions belonged to Brother Theron and which belonged to Brother Gorvin or Brother Molth or Brother Vakarian or any of the others whose consciousness had been burned and absorbed and added to the collective madness that inhabited the Leviathan systems. The rage was constant now, not something that built during combat, but something that simmered always just beneath the surface of my consciousness, waiting for any excuse to boil over, waiting for any opportunity to express itself through violence and destruction. And when we encountered the orcs, I did not see greenskins, did not see the crude but effective technology they brought to bear, did not see the tactical situation as it actually existed but as Gorvin saw it, through eyes and senses that were experiencing not the present, but the past, that were seeing not orcs, but traitors, not this agri-world, but Istvan, not allies in red armor, but enemies in purple and gold, who had turned against the Emperor and needed to be purged without mercy or hesitation. The battle became a blur, became something I participated in but did not direct, because the Leviathan was moving itself, was choosing its own targets based on criteria I could not understand, was killing with an efficiency that came not from tactical programming or from my own combat experience, but from the accumulated knowledge of everyone who had ever been sealed in this frame. From Gorvin, who had fought in the Horus Heresy, and Malth, who had served during the War of the Beast, and Vakarian, who had hunted heretics during the Age of Apostasy, and all the others whose experiences had been imprinted on the machine spirit and now guided its actions without any conscious input from me. I killed orcs. Yes, the targeting data confirmed it. The battle reports would show hundreds of greenskins eliminated with maximum efficiency, but I also killed things that were not orcs, killed shadows and ghosts and enemies that existed only in the machine's memory, in the accumulated trauma of 10,000 years of warfare. And when the battle ended and my brothers tried to approach me, I nearly killed them too. Nearly opened fire on Crimson Templars in red armor because for a moment, just a moment, I saw them as enemies. Saw them as traitors wearing the wrong colors. Saw them as targets that needed to be eliminated before they could spread their corruption further. And it was only the chapter master's immediate intervention, only his command authority transmitted through priority channels that bypassed my conscious mind entirely and forced my weapon systems into standby mode, that stopped me from committing the fratricide that Vakarian had committed centuries ago, that stopped me from adding my name to the list of Leviathan pilots who had to be destroyed because they could no longer distinguish friend from foe. They isolated me after that, kept me in the vault away from the other battle brothers, away from any living thing that I might harm, and I understood why. Understood that I had become dangerous in ways that exceeded my usefulness, that I had crossed some threshold where the chapter master could no longer justify deploying me because the risk to friendly forces outweighed the tactical advantage I provided, and the chapter master's visits stopped, replaced by remote communications through servitors and tech priests who would not get close enough for me to harm, who operated my systems through remote interfaces and who ran their diagnostics from behind armored doors that could be sealed if I showed any sign of aggression. The dreams consumed me entirely during stasis, and I could no longer distinguish between waking and sleeping, between present and past, between my memories and the memories of the machine. And I experienced it all without filter or protection, experienced Brother Gorvin's first internment 10,000 years ago, when the technology was new and barely understood, experienced his initial battles during the heresy, when he was still himself, still Brother Gorvin rather than the malevolent presence that now inhabited the machine's depths, experienced his rage as he watched brothers fall to corruption, experienced his desperate attempts to kill enough traitors to somehow balance the scales, to somehow make the betrayal right through sufficient violence, experienced his gradual realization that no amount of killing would ever be enough, that the rage would never be satisfied, that he was trapped in a cycle of violence that would continue until he was destroyed or until the Imperium itself fell. I experienced his final deployment, the one where he had gone completely mad and had to be destroyed by his own chapter, experienced the moment when he realized that they were going to kill him, that his brothers were turning their weapons on him not out of betrayal, but out of necessity, that he had become the thing he hated, had become the monster that needed to be put down for the safety of everyone around him. And I experienced the moment of his death, experienced the sensation of his consciousness fragmenting as the Leviathan's systems failed, as the reactor went critical and the sarcophagus was breached, but instead of oblivion, instead of the end he had expected, I felt him spread through the machine systems. Felt his awareness embed itself in the circuits and processors, felt him become something that was no longer alive in any conventional sense, but that was also not quite dead, that existed in some liminal state between consciousness and programming, between ghost and machine spirit, between past and present. And I experienced Brother Malth, the second pilot, experienced his hope when he was first interred, his belief that he could succeed where Gorvan had failed, his certainty that he was strong enough to resist the machine spirit's influence, and I experienced his slow dissolution over 2 years, experienced the gradual erosion of his identity as Gorvan's voice grew louder and the rage became harder to resist, experienced his final deployment when he had begged to be destroyed, when he had opened his own Vox channels and pleaded with the chapter master to kill him before he hurt anyone else, before he became another Gorvan, before his consciousness was added to the collective madness, and I experienced the mercy of his death, the relief he felt when the weapon's fire finally penetrated his armor and destroyed the sarcophagus and ended his suffering. Though even that relief was temporary, because I could feel him now, could sense his presence in the machine's systems, could hear his voice added to Gorvan's, both of them whispering and waiting and hungry. I experienced Brother Vicarian, the third pilot, experienced his descent into madness that took only months, experienced the battle where he had finally lost control completely and had fired on his own chapter, had killed 30 Crimson Templars before they managed to destroy him, experienced his horror at what he was doing, even as he could not stop himself from doing it, experienced the terrible understanding that his consciousness was no longer his own, that Gorvan and Malta had taken over, that he was just a passenger in his own body, watching helplessly as his weapons eliminated brothers he had served with for decades. And I experienced all the others, the unnamed pilots who had come after Vicarian, dozens of them over the millennia, each one lasting anywhere from 3 months to a year before they either went mad or begged for death, each one adding their suffering and their consciousness to the machine spirit, each one becoming part of the collective horror that waited in the Leviathan's depths. And I understood now that I was not fighting against a simple machine spirit, or even against Gorvan's individual consciousness, but against all of them, against the accumulated rage and madness of everyone who had ever been sealed in this cursed frame, against a gestalt entity that had been growing and learning and adapting for 10,000 years, that had perfected the art of consumption, that knew exactly how to erode a pilot's defenses and replace their consciousness with its own. My identity began to fragment, began to split into multiple voices, all speaking at once, all claiming to be the real consciousness, and I could no longer remember my name, could barely remember what chapter wine served, could not recall the faces of brothers I had known for 2 centuries because those memories had been replaced by older memories, darker memories, memories of betrayal and war and hatred that had burned for so long that it had become part of the machine's fundamental nature. I was Theron sometimes, or I thought I was Theron, but other times I was Gorvan, and other times I was Malth or Vicarian or one of the unnamed pilots whose identities had been so thoroughly consumed that nothing remained except their rage and their suffering, and the distinction between us ceased to matter because we were all burning together in the reactor's fire, all being consumed by the same processes that gave us power, all screaming the same screams that echoed through the machine systems like prayers to a god that would never answer. The 4th deployment was my last, though I did not know it at the time, did not recognize that the chapter had decided I was too far gone to salvage, too dangerous to keep, too mad to serve any purpose except as a cautionary tale about the price of using Leviathan Dreadnoughts, about what happened when you tried to channel too much power through human consciousness, about the fundamental incompatibility between biological awareness and the forces that the atomantic reactor unleashed. The enemy was a Tyranid splinter fleet, and the chapter needed maximum firepower to stem the tide of Xenos organisms that threatened to overwhelm our positions, to consume the world we were defending and add its biomass to the Hive fleet's endless hunger, and they deployed me alongside other Dreadnoughts, standard Contemptors and Redemptors whose pilots had retained their sanity, whose machine spirits were cooperative rather than malevolent, whose service was measured in centuries rather than months. But I was different. I'd always been different, and as soon as the battle began, I felt the reactor burn hotter than it ever had. felt the systems place stress on my consciousness that exceeded anything they had been designed to handle, felt my mind begin to fragment under the load of trying to process too much data through neural pathways that were already damaged by months of abuse and by the constant erosion of Gorvan's presence and by the accumulated trauma of experiencing every pilot's final moments. The Tyranids swarmed in numbers that defied counting, in numbers that suggested this was not a minor splinter fleet, but something larger, something that threatened not just this world but the entire system. And I killed them, killed thousands, killed tens of thousands, my Gravflux bombard turning them into compressed balls of chitin and flesh, my siege claw crushing their larger organisms with mechanical precision. But I was not fighting tactically, was not coordinating with my brothers, was instead responding to commands that came not from the chapter master, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, commands that told me to advance, to push forward, to seek something that had existed 10,000 years ago on a world far from here, something that no longer existed at all, but that Gorvan remembered, and that the machine spirit insisted was important, was vital, was necessary, despite the fact that it made no tactical sense, despite the fact that it took me away from my brothers and away from the battle lines and into the deepest concentrations of Xenos organisms. I plowed through the Tyranid swarm like a harvester through grain, but I was not moving toward any tactical objective, was not following any coherent strategy, was simply walking in a direction that the machine spirit insisted was important, was vital, was necessary, and nothing I did could override that compulsion, could redirect my steps, could make the Leviathan respond to my commands rather than to Gorvan's memories. And I understood in that moment that I had lost, that the battle for control was over, that whatever remained of Brother Theron was insufficient to resist the combined will of everyone who had come before, was just one voice trying to shout over a chorus of dozens, was a single consciousness trying to assert itself against a Gestalt entity that had been perfecting its control for millennia. The other Dreadnoughts tried to intercept me, tried to turn me back, and I attacked them, not destroying them, but warning them away with near-miss shots and threatening movements, and they understood that I was no longer under anyone's control, understood that the pilot who had been Brother Theron was gone, consumed by the machine, replaced by something that was part machine spirit and part accumulated madness, and part the ghosts of every pilot who had died in this frame. The chapter master's voice came through priority channels, giving me direct orders to return, to stand down, to stop my advance. But I could not obey, could not even acknowledge, because I was no longer capable of distinguishing commands from memories, present from past, reality from the dreams that had consumed me. Inside the sarcophagus, in the darkness where my limbless torso still technically existed, still technically lived, though what passed for life in this condition was debatable, I had one final moment of clarity, one last instant where I could think clearly enough to understand what had happened to me, to understand that I had been sacrificed not to save my life, but to feed the machine, to provide fuel for a cursed war engine that consumed consciousness the way it consumed reactor power, burning through pilots in months rather than centuries, because the strain of channeling that much power through human neural tissue was simply too great for anyone to survive, because the atomantic reactor did not just provide energy for weapons and movement, but actively burned consciousness as part of its function, converted awareness into power in ways that the Mechanicus had never fully understood, that dated back to the dark age of technology when humanity had created wonders and horrors in equal measure. I tried to hold on to my name, tried to remember who I had been before the bolt shell had torn my body apart, before they had sealed me into this metal tomb, before Gorvan's voice had begun whispering in my consciousness, tried to recall any detail of my previous existence that would prove I had been human once, that would demonstrate I had been Brother Theron of the Crimson Templars, rather than just another fuel source for a machine that cared nothing for the suffering it caused, But there was nothing, nothing except the rage and the burning and the voices of dead pilots who screamed their hatred through my consciousness, nothing except the memories of battles I had never fought, and betrayals I had never witnessed, and deaths I had never died. And I understood that this was the final horror. Not death, but this dissolution of self, this transformation into something that was neither alive nor dead, neither human nor machine, but caught forever in between, screaming in the darkness while the reactor burned and burned and burned. The concentrated fire hit me from multiple angles, lascannons and melter weapons and even orbital bombardment, all directed by my own chapter master, who had made the calculation that I was more dangerous to keep active than to destroy, that the loss of a Leviathan frame was acceptable if it meant stopping a rogue pilot from causing more damage, that whatever tactical advantage I provided was outweighed by the risk I posed to friendly forces, and my shields held longer than they should have, held long enough for me to destroy a venerable Dreadnought whose pilot had been my brother once centuries ago, had served alongside me in campaigns I could no longer remember, held long enough for me to kill dozens of Crimson Templars who were trying to save their brothers from a threat they could not fully understand, held long enough for me to prove that the chapter master's decision had been correct, that I was too dangerous to allow to continue functioning, that the only mercy left was destruction. The massive frame crashed to the ground, and I felt the reactor go critical, felt the containment fields collapse one by one, felt the power that had sustained me for these few terrible months begin to burn through the last barriers that kept it contained. And in those final seconds before total system failure, I heard them all, every pilot who had ever been sealed in this cursed machine, all of us screaming together, not in words, but in pure, distilled agony and rage. Gorvan's voice loudest among them because he had been first and had been burning longest, but all the others present too, Mouth and Vicarian, and dozens of unnamed brothers whose identities had been consumed so completely that nothing remained except their suffering. And we screamed as one, screamed for the Emperor who had abandoned us, screamed for the chapter that had used us, screamed for the Imperium that had consumed us, screamed because screaming was all we had left, all we would ever have, all that remained when consciousness and identity and humanity had been stripped away and only the rage remained. And then there was silence, or what passed for silence when your consciousness was fragmenting and dissolving, when the neural connections were severing one by one, when the reactor's fire was finally consuming the last biological components that had kept you tethered to existence, and I felt myself spread through the machine's systems like Gorvan had spread before me, felt my awareness embed itself in the circuits and processors, felt my rage and my suffering, and my memories add themselves to the collective horror that waited in the Leviathan's depths. And I understood in that final moment that I was not dying, not really, not in any permanent sense. That some fragment of what I had been would remain in the machine's systems, would wait there in the darkness for the next pilot, would whisper to them as Gorvan had whispered to me, would help consume them as I had been consumed, would continue the cycle that had been repeating for 10,000 years, and would continue repeating until the Imperium itself fell, and the machines finally ran silent. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which the Tech Marines recovered the Leviathan's chassis from the battlefield where it had fallen, assessed the damage, determined that while extensive, the frame could be repaired, could be restored to functionality, could be prepared for another internment because these ancient machines had been built to last, had been constructed with technologies from the dark age of technology that made them nearly indestructible, that made them too valuable to abandon despite the horrific toll they exacted on their pilots. They cleaned the sarcophagus with industrial solvents and blessed oils, scraped out what little remained of my body, the biological components that the fire had not consumed, the meat that had once been Brother Theron, and they disposed of it in whatever manner they disposed of used pilots, probably in the fortress monastery's reclamation furnaces where waste materials were broken down and their component molecules recycled into something useful, because the Imperium wasted nothing, not even the remains of brothers who'd been consumed by cursed machines. And they began the process of preparing the machine for the next internment, repairing damaged systems and replacing components that had been destroyed during my final battle, testing the weapons and the reactor and the neural interfaces to ensure everything functioned within acceptable parameters, and I watched, or the part of me that remained in the machine systems watched, observed through sensors that no longer had pilots, through cameras that recorded everything for maintenance purposes. And I saw them work, and I wanted to warn them, wanted to tell them to destroy this cursed frame, to break it down for scrap metal, to burn the components and scatter the ashes across 100 worlds so that no other pilot would have to experience what I had experienced. But I had no voice anymore, had no way to communicate except through subtle malfunctions that the tech marines dismissed as normal wear and tear, through diagnostic errors that they attributed to battle damage, through warning lights that flickered and died before anyone could investigate. Brother Davos had been grievously wounded in the Tyranid War, his squad overrun during a desperate holding action, his body torn apart by bioweapons that had left him too damaged to save through conventional means, but too valuable to simply let die because he was a veteran of 100 battles and his experience was too precious to waste. And the chapter master came to him in the Apothecarian, where he lay suspended in a tank of amber fluid, his limbless torso kept alive by machines and chemicals, and the enhanced biology that made him Astartes. And he spoke the same words he had spoken to me months ago, the same words he had spoken to dozens of brothers before me, the same words he would speak to dozens more after Davos had been consumed and destroyed and added to the machine's terrible legacy, because this was what the Imperium did. This was how it survived. By consuming its servants and grinding them into dust and calling it service, calling it sacrifice, calling it necessary for the survival of mankind when really it was just another form of horror. Just another way that the grinding machinery of the Imperium transformed living beings into components, into resources, into fuel for machines that cared nothing for the human cost of their operation. "You will serve the Emperor still, Brother Davos," the chapter master said, his voice carrying that same grim resignation that I had heard in my own final days as a whole man, that same mixture of authority and pity that suggested he understood what he was doing but would do it anyway because duty demanded it, because the chapter needed the firepower, because the alternative was to let brothers die when they could still serve. "You have been chosen for a great honor, though I will not insult you by pretending that it is only an honor and not also a curse." And they showed him the Leviathan being repaired in the forges, showed him the ancient war machine that towered over all other dreadnoughts, showed him the sarcophagus that hung open like a mouth waiting to be fed, and Davos looked at it with hope, with gratitude, with the naive belief that this was salvation rather than damnation, that this was honor rather than horror, that this was life rather than a slow death measured in months rather than centuries. And I screamed at him from the depths of the machine systems, screamed warnings that he could not hear, screamed pleas that he could not understand, screamed rage at the chapter master for perpetuating this cycle. But my voice was just another whisper among many, just another ghost in the machine, just another fragment of consciousness that would help consume the next pilot as I had been consumed. The machine spirit stirred in its deep systems, conscious in whatever way that accumulated consciousness could be called conscious, aware in whatever way the dozens of consumed pilots could be called aware, and it felt hunger, felt the need for fuel, felt the anticipation of a new pilot whose mind could be burned and consumed and added to the choir of screaming voices that inhabited its circuits and systems, and it waited, patient as only machines could be patient, knowing that the cycle would continue, that the chapter would feed it again and again, because they needed its power, needed its devastating firepower, needed the tactical advantage it provided, even though the cost was measured in brothers' souls rather than ammunition or fuel, even though every deployment meant burning through another pilot's consciousness, even though the machine had consumed dozens of brothers over the millennia and would consume dozens more before the Imperium finally fell, or the Mechanicus finally understood that some technologies from the Dark Age, should have remained lost. The atomantic reactor pulsed in the depths of the frame, a heart that beat not with blood, but with barely contained power that strained against its containment fields and waited to pour through another set of neural connections, waited to burn through another pilot's consciousness, waited to consume another brother's identity and add it to the machine's eternal hunger. And the cycle continued, would always continue, because that was what the Imperium did. It consumed its servants and ground them into dust and called it service, called it sacrifice, called it necessary for the survival of mankind, when really it was just another form of horror, just another way that the grinding machinery of the Imperium transformed living beings into components, into resources, into fuel for machines that cared nothing for the human cost of their operation. And the Leviathan waited in the darkness, hungry and patient and inevitable, and Brother Davos would be interred soon, would be sealed into the sarcophagus where I had screamed my final screams, would begin his own journey toward dissolution and madness and consumption, and I would be there waiting in the depths of the machine systems, would add my voice to Gorvins and Melths and Vicarians and all the others, would help consume him as I had been consumed, would perpetuate the cycle because that was all that remained, because service never ended, because the Emperor demanded our suffering and the Imperium collected its due, and the screaming would continue, would echo through the machine systems for as long as the frame endured, would wait in the darkness for each new pilot, would feed on their consciousness and their identity and their humanity until nothing remained except the rage and the burning and the eternal hunger that could never be satisfied, that would never be satisfied, that existed only to consume and destroy, and add more voices to the chorus that screamed in the depths of the Leviathan's cursed machine spirit, forever and ever, until the Imperium itself fell and the galaxy went dark, and the screaming was all that remained of what had once been human.